So, hello, Sally. How are you?
Hello, David. Um, I'm fine-ish.
Ish, yes. Well, we won't discuss the grim details.
No, let's not. Let's move to happier things.
While there's still any available in the world around us, you know.
Exactly.
Whether, well, as it happens, we're talking again in part because you are the person I've spoken to uh, in this series of dilatory, self-indulgent conversations whose reappearance has been requested the most frequently.
Oh, wow.
Now, it's also the fact that I like talking to you, and it's just an excuse to
That's,
chat.
that's good
But
enough for me.
actually, yes, it's because you've won over the legions of my readers. So,
Well,
um,
I'm honored.
now, quite a I think also it had something to do. I mean, aside from the fact that you're charming, personable, wise, witty, eloquent, all that. I think people just like hearing people talk about fairies and things like that. So
Yeah,
I think that the topic
yeah.
was. So I thought before, I don't even know what we're talking about exactly. I have a list of topics, but they're so diffuse now, the any point of entry. But I think we agreed to exchange bad opera performance stories. I don't know if you're still willing to do that. If you're up for it, I mean, I can start, or I can let you start. The story I have to tell, I've told before. It's something of a classic, I like to think now, um, but it's up to you. Who should start?
You start.
All
You start.
right, all right. Well,
I
let
don't know that
me.
mine are at the forefront of my mind, so
Well, actually, if you're willing to talk about it, I was interested in the recent performance of Salome you sat through in Paris.
oh
Uh,
God, yes. Do you know, I'd repressed that totally from my mind. I was
Content.
thinking, but wanting to hear about the performance of Soul, where there was a total inability for Saul to actually pull down the pillars, and everybody appeared to survive quite intact, which rather
Yeah,
spoiled the
it's a
whole.
revisionist telling of the tale.
It was a definite revisionist telling the tale. I suppose we can say on the side of life, but not really in accord with the story as we've been taught it. But the Salome one was, it was well, essentially, it amounted to the fact that the reason given in the production for Salome's seeking the head of John the Baptist was that she'd been subjected to a gang rape by the entire
Goodness.
Herod court. And this took place in the most graphic way in front of the audience. We'd been warned that there may be features in the story and the production that we might find would make us uncomfortable. And I think everybody thought that they were familiar enough with the story not to be made too uncomfortable by it. But my God, I was made uncomfortable by this. And it was entirely that Salome was the victim of, and she was subject to sexual abuse, which I suppose you could read a little bit into the actual story. There is an element of that, but certainly I don't think is any kind of explanation for why she should seek the head of John the Baptist. And
It also seems to make inexplicable why the head of John the Baptist was tendered. I mean, if she's.
yes, how did this help?
Well, that is a disturbing. Now that I recall the story, maybe I should have gone with the Saul anecdote, but it's curious. I mean, yeah, it would seem. Not only does I'm not quite sure why it's good to deprive her of agency and power in the telling of the story, but I'm also not sure then what sense the rest of the story makes. Um,
I've forgotten to add an important feature, which is the famous dance that she performs, that's supposed to be so beguiling and erotic, consisted of her being passed from male character to male character and having at each passage through in this great circle, having an item of her clothing removed.
I see.
So actually, I felt that the whole thing being turned into this subject of sexual abuse was in itself actually rather abusive and indeed pornographic.
Yeah,
So,
I do wonder what's in the director's mind then. I mean, you do wonder if the director who devises this production has motives that are other than entirely pure, you know.
I can't say, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's rather disturbing. So let's talk about the soul performance instead. That sounds funnier. Because my story all has to do with malfunctioning stage machinery as well. It was a horrible performance, but the stage machinery sort of capped the night for us. It was actually, as I say, I've told the story before. It was in 2008, but it's been that long ago. But it's stayed with me indelibly. It was at the Met. It was Tristan und Isolde. It was a famously cursed production anyway, because they'd already lost 2 Tristans. I mean, New York was dangerously running out of Tristans at that point. They were down to Gary Lehman, and they called on him after the first 2. I think one broke his leg, another got some illness. Deborah Voigt was Isolde, and she had in one performance had to leave the stage with ptomaine. You know, so it was already a cursed performance, but all of those events sort of distracted, I think, from the real problem with it, was that the director was clearly insane.
yes,
it made no sense. The sets, the props, the costumes were all the most conspicuous, and what turned out to be the most catastrophic aspect of it was that the entire opera, all 3 acts, were performed on a stage at an incline, a rather violent incline, not quite 45 degrees, but, you know, still towards the front of the stage. And at the beginning of the 3rd act, while, and again, it made no sense. Tristan is on his deathbed, on his pallet, surrounded by things like rocking horses and other children's toys and toy castles in what looks like a nursery, but a nursery, you know, with a kind of cabinet of Dr. Caligari appearance. And for some reason, as the Vorspiel was playing, he was lowered on a cable pallet head first down the incline of the stage towards a depression in the floor that was supposed automatically to give way under him and accommodate him. But they had gotten, apparently, they were a little bit off kilter that night, so his pallet didn't settle into the bed. And after he had been suspended there for about 2 minutes, the cable broke, and he went sledding down the stage headfirst into the yeah, well, it was lovely, really. He cracked his head on.
Poor fellow. So he's not got enough to put up with in the opera.
But he did soldier through. He got up. They put a bandage on his head. He drank a glass of water. They started it all over, lowering him down the stage again. I would have given up on that part myself, but nonetheless, lowering him down the stage. And then at the end, Deborah Voigt sang the Liebestod beautifully. I mean, she has a gorgeous voice. But then she didn't die. And this I found very disappointing. Now, I've learned since from a good friend of mine named Judith Wolf that it's an old issue as to whether, in fact, Wagner did intend it to be he never called it a Liebestod. And when you look at the libretto, it does not specifically say that she then perishes from love or from passion or from longing. It's just, that's, of course, I think, how it's always been performed. I mean, I can't go back in time to Bayreuth to see his production, but I've always assumed that the history of productions is followed from his original version. But anyway, I was deeply angry at this because well, I mean, as I said, I've said in the past, I paid my price for admission, and I was entitled to one dead soprano at the end of the opera, and I felt I'd been, yeah. I don't know why we're starting here, but I just.
By the way, I just realized when I say Saul, of course, I mean Samson.
Oh, that's right. So it's funny you carry me. Right. Well, they're both by Handel. You know, I've
just been listening to Saul. That's why I said.
Well, which Samson are we talking about? Handel's. Or yeah, so you can get that confused because he did a Saul as well. And,
exactly.
If the pillars didn't come down, though, I mean,
it wasn't a technical error. It was deliberate.
Okay, well then now I'm in.
Somehow the whole story was turned into something quite other. I mean, why
did he make an effort to pull them down?
Not much of an effort to pull them down, no. I mean, he came down center stage, leaving everybody perfectly hale and hearty behind him. And the structure didn't even shudder, so it didn't really make sense. But I think for some reason, it's very difficult for a modern director to leave any kind of work alone. There's a sort of compulsion to overlay it with some kind of individual interpretation. I mean, I remember when my children were quite small and I'd taken them to a number of versions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and one day my youngest son said, rather philosophically, it would be nice to see the fairies one day with actual wings, because all the fairies we'd seen, you know, had been wearing Doc Martens and leathers, covered in mud and tattoos, and it was not that he had a particular penchant for fairies with wings, but he just felt it would be quite interesting to see a very novel production in which they actually perhaps flew or did something somewhat similar. But
something
speaking of fairies, we were going to talk about fairy tales again, weren't we?
Yeah, no, I know this was where we left off last time, and as I say, I think that was what everyone found so captivating was the fairy talk. But what we discovered in the interim is that we share a really intense dislike for Hans Christian Andersen.
Yes, I have a loathing for Hans Christian Andersen, and the loathing comes from, first of all, I find particularly the Red Shoes, which we've discussed, but also The Little Mermaid. In fact, this came out of my telling you about the production of Rusalka, which was rather well done, in fact, unlike the productions we've been discussing. And I was saying how much I preferred Rusalka to Hans Andersen's Little Mermaid, although Rusalka is not, I mean, it alludes to the Rusalkas who are water spirits. It's not an actually defined story. But I think what is so objectionable about Hans Christian Andersen, and I'm sure you share it, is this use of the tale in order to exercise what strikes me as a kind of moralizing sadism, that he deliberately submits both his heroines to a completely unnecessary physical maiming. And in the case of the Red Shoes, I mean, he uses it as a moralizing exercise, which no real fairy story will ever do. There are moral ingredients, I think, in a fairy story, but they will never be used in that sort of punitive, directed way. And I regard his stories as really perverse. I think they are perversions. They seem to miss all the fundamental characteristic of a fairy story, which is, I mean, I actually think they're like dreams, fairy stories. I would say that I was trying to think about them before having this conversation. I think that the fairy story is like a collective version of a dream, in that it brings up unconscious elements, and through the experience of the story, our conscious selves are able to engage with unconscious elements that probably run through all societies. I mean, without, leaving aside various cultural variations which inevitably happen as in different kinds of societies as history develops. But there are moral features. I mean, kindness and compassion and perseverance, and particularly fearlessness, which is a very interesting quality. These kind of qualities are available, and you might call that moralistic, but they're never punitive.
Well, you see, I think, just not moralistic. I mean, I wouldn't use that word at all. I've always thought that in a true fairy story, precisely because there's a somewhat antinomian or immoral quality to fairy, that it touches on a deeper morality that does consist in kindness and is, in a sense, outside the law, and that the special morality of a true fairy story, and you see it in really great, well, I mean, George MacDonald's fairy stories, for instance, all right, well, he's a devout Christian, but he's not a moralist. The moral reality of his tales is almost invariably of mercy triumphing over justice, or of a kind of freedom. I mean, and also a recognition that there's a kind of antinomianism in the innocence of children that is healthier than the sort of guarded morality that adults have to cultivate in themselves, precisely because they're nearer the source.
I think, too, it's very often a matter of trusting to luck and fate. I mean, trusting to luck is one of the features you find in fairy stories, and trusting to fate. So you will find in what I call a true fairy story, the hero or heroine, who, by the way, is always part of the dispossessed. I mean, in the wonderful Irish term, it's always the young man who's not quite the full shilling,
right,
or who doesn't have his father's respect, or the girl who has been set aside by usually her stepmother and possibly her sisters, or whoever. So these are always, and I suppose in a sense this is what these fairy stories share with Christianity. It's the poor, not so much in spirit, but in recognition and regard of the society into which they're born. So they're outcasts nearly always. But what they do is they tend to trust. Often it's the voice of nature. I mean, there's a fairy story I like very much called The Golden Bird, in which the young man he meets a fox, and the fox says, "You have to chop off my paws. You have to chop off all my paws and my head and my tail." And the young man's horrified. But he does what he's asked, and it's only through that the fox can be transformed back into the prince.
right.
So it sometimes involves doing some rather horrible things. But there is this trust, and it's sometimes trust in nature, the works of the little mice or the little birds. But I think in a larger sense, it's trust in luck, and in an even larger sense, it's trust in fate. And I think perhaps that's the connection with the children as well.
Yeah,
and also this being non-regarding of the moral laws of adulthood. As you say, the antinomian element.
Well, yeah, which is, I mean, since you mentioned Christianity, of course, there's a formidable antinomian element in the Christianity of the New Testament. Sure, I mean, often overlooked, but I mean, it's definitely there in Paul, in which so much of liberation from the bondage of sin is liberation from consciousness of and subjection to the law, even though the law is, as a remedial thing, a good thing. It's also defective because it's an alienation from a more primordial innocence and spiritual freedom, and that's certainly true in, say, the Gospel of John. And this is very much a running theme. For those who don't know,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, we talked about the red shoes, so I should point out, for those who don't know the story.
I'm sorry, yes.
It's about a little girl who likes to dance, which, most of us would regard as a rather delightful premise for a fairy tale. And so it seems at first, quite pleasant. But of course, she dances at the inappropriate times, and she loves her red shoes, and she loves dancing in her red shoes. And gosh, it's been so long I don't even remember. But I think it's like she's cursed because of her wickedness, because she sinfully dances at a funeral.
Well, it's to do with not regarding the church, since we're talking. I mean, this is Hans Andersen's Christianity is precisely opposite of the kind you just.
No, it's the sort of grimmest. Grimmest Northern European Protestantism you can think of. It was, and as the story, so she can't stop dancing, she can't remove the shoes, and then she has to go to the village headman to have her feet chopped off so she can be delivered from her. Anyway, I'll stop there. All I remember is that I read that probably when I was 9, and I was not prepared for it, and it makes me think that there's something in this idea of trigger warnings out there, because I was moving from the world of Winnie the Pooh and Wind in the Willows into this world, and I picked up even as a child that there was something bizarrely sadistic in the imagination behind it, because it's clear that the logic of the story is that everything that happens to the little girl, and she is a little girl,
yes,
is entirely condign. This is, she's getting her comeuppance because she was wicked. It's like Struwwelpeter, it's just a remarkably cruel story. But I mean, I agree with you. There is this kind of strange, morbid moralism running throughout Hans Christian Andersen. So I've always thought that his stories really don't qualify as real fairy tales.
Oh, I don't think they do. I mean, whereas George MacDonald, I think he's one of the very few people who, as an individual, rather than, I mean, I think the best folk stories are a kind of collective of tales that have been told and refined and retold over many, many years, and they take on various folk qualities and various mythic qualities as the tales evolve. But I think George MacDonald was in his stories. I mean, I'm thinking now of the Princess, the Goblin, and the Princess and Curdie.
Right.
I think those are real fairy stories. And one of the things about those stories that I loved as a child was that the princess visits a grandmother. Of course, grandmothers are another archetypal feature of fairy stories, which, being a grandmother myself now, I'm always rather pleased to find grandmothers in these old stories. And she sees this remarkable woman who exists, as often in fairy stories, in a part of the house that no one else can seem to find. And she herself cannot always find, because it involves going up and up and up and up and up. And I think that's interesting too, because there's some sort of imagery of higher levels of consciousness. But when her friend Curdie goes to the same room in search of this famous grandmother who is able to change image and do remarkable things with the moon and with light and so forth. All he sees is an old broom and some withered leaves. So it's something to do, what George MacDonald has picked up is that fairy stories are also about the ability to see through the quotidian into a higher or a deeper. I never know where we are on these images of height and depth.
I think it's higher up and deeper in is the phrase from C.S. Lewis, right? The sort of Christian Platonist imagery.
But anyway, a world beyond the quotidian world, which is vouchsafed, I think, to children, and I think we are progressively schooled out of as we get older, although some of us try and preserve that particular sense.
Well, some people have a genius for it, preserving it. I mean, I think this is. Far be it from me to psychologize myths like the Garden of Eden, because here's a spoiler. We're going to move into the myth of Eden at some point here.
I'm looking forward to being in Eden. A great improvement on my present circumstance.
But it is true, isn't it? I mean, there is this. We remember, I think, being baffled by the world as children. I don't know if we always acutely remember, as we should, that as children we experience it as a delighted wonder because everything's miraculous. I mean, there's no, we're seized. I think in childhood we realize there's something strange and uncanny about just the fact that we are and that the world are, but it doesn't explain itself. It comes to us as a series of miraculous visions. And later in life, even when we've forgotten that, there are these privileged moments when we're not thinking about anything as such. And suddenly, because we're not thinking about anything as such, the sheer mysteriousness of everything altogether becomes evident to us, and we have this momentary return to that childlike wonder. And I think the trick of living a wise life is recognizing that that's a sounder apprehension of the nature of reality, of its strangeness, of its givenness. I mean, obviously, we like explanations, we like factual knowledge, all of that's important. But behind that, the awareness that all of it, no matter how well we understand it, or think we understand it, that it's always surrounded by and immersed in a far deeper mystery and wonder. And I think the art of the really great, George MacDonald, I think, is an example of this. Someone had a genius for returning to that apprehension without cynicism, without disenchantment, but without just pure credulity. I mean, there's the wisdom of years there as well,
and without sentimentality. He's never sentimental.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true.
The purity of vision that's never sickly or twee, or there's something very clear in his vision. I imagine he was like that himself. I think he too was someone who didn't lose the childhood vision.
I was about to say, not twee or sentimental like Peter Pan. Barry could be a bit.
Sure.
Yeah. But yeah, no, my one, I think I told you, my one moment of rock and roll fame is that a line from one of my books was used without permission, I might add, without permission or attribution until very late in the day for a concert tour by U2 and some big video production they had. And the line was simply that wisdom is the recovery of innocence at the far end of experience.
Yeah.
But I honestly, I mean, I believe that's true. Yes. That we're always trying to recover what as children we knew, and then laboriously made ourselves forget, and then have to remember again at the far end of experience in order finally to achieve the ability to see things as they are. I mean, there's, of course, this has come to think of it the way Owen Barfield thought of the whole history of humanity. He seemed to think that we moved from a kind of immediacy of participation in things, that we had, that all of humanity has a kind of spiritual life story in which we began in a close but uncritical immediate participation in the mystery of things and in the sort of revelatory nature of experience of the world about us. We become estranged from it, tragically but necessarily, but that ultimately, and this was his great optimism, we would return to a kind of post-critical naivete, to use Paul Ricoeur's term, and that we'd be able to, there would be the second kind of participation, which would be a participation that included also knowledge and critical awareness. And so I'm not sure that will ever happen. But
it's Blake's idea, isn't it? I mean, your line very much describes Blake's idea of we move out of innocence into experience and then into a further kind of innocence from which we have presumably learnt from experience. I mean, it would be wonderful to think that was the likely history of humankind.
We can at least think it's a possible history.
It's good that it's a possible, I think, because I think without those possibles, and I think that's also what fairy stories do. And of course, as you know, but lots of people don't, they weren't originally just intended for children.
No.
I mean, they were for everybody. They were told to adults as much as children. I mean, hence the rather frightening aspects of some of the fairy stories, which I'm sure would now all be edited out, were they to be.
Well, that's my great dread. I mean, I as for things like the red shoes, I have no, I would just advise people not to waste.
I'm not in favor of cancelling, but I would cancel Hans Andersen.
Well, I would just say leave it on the shelf. I mean, or if you're going to read it, wait until you're 47 and have a bottle of whiskey open next to the reading table that can get you through it, and then if you read it with a realization that you're getting a certain lesson in certain psychopathologies along with the story. I mean, I do worry about that. I remember, I love animals. For instance, I get terrifically sentimental at the thought of a squirrel getting hit by a car. I understand this, but for instance, you can't go to a performance of Peter and the Wolf now that ends with the wolf actually dying. The wolf eats the other characters, and in order, before they can be set free, in the original telling with that rough Russian, wolves are actually, if you've ever seen a wolf in the wild, you can understand why it wouldn't necessarily immediately strike someone as cute and adorable. But and while I understand that, and that children love animals and all that, I do find it a bit odd. I remember taking my son when he was a small child to a performance, and this was my first experience of the wolf living somehow freeing the creatures in his stomach, freeing all the people, the goose and then joining in a round dance with the other characters. I do have a certain fear of that becoming more and more a common way. If these, the fairy tales and folk tales continue to be told at all, they'll be turned ever more and more into anodyne stories that for just that reason are moralistic in a different way, that make no room for the real darkness. You don't find it. George MacDonald, for instance, something I can't imagine happening. I might, but at the back of the North Wind, which is a wonderful book, but Diamond, the main child, does not live to the end of the story.
Do you know, that is actually my favorite George MacDonald, because it's the first one I read.
Right.
And when I read it, had no idea he'd died.
Really?
No, none at all. I never understood him. I didn't. I read the book and then I reread it when I was much older, and I thought, oh my good heavens, this is a book about dying. But as a child, I just went totally along with it. And the fact that all the way through there are hints that this is his own death, that he's being taken to through the agency of the North Wind, completely passed over me. I just thought it was a remarkable story, and I loved it. And I loved the North Wind.
Yes.
I mean, I wanted to be Diamond. So I think that too, how we read something alters quite dramatically as we acquire experience. We start to see things with much more focused eyes. And on the matter of the terrifying aspects of the story, if I'm right that they are like a collective version of a society's dreams, then I'm now speaking in my capacity of my old profession as a Jungian analyst. I've part company with a lot of Jung, and I'm by no means a Jungian any longer. But there are various aspects of Jung I still respect, and I still think he was right about. And one of the things he felt that happened in dreams is that we confronted the shadow aspects of ourselves in order to give us an opportunity to relate to them in a manner that would allow us to absorb some of that quality into our conscious selves, so that it wouldn't act in a destructive way, both on ourselves and on the people we were meeting and connected to. So I think one of the functions of fairy stories is precisely to present those aspects of human life and human experience that precisely are frightening and destructive and dangerous, which children are very able to take in fact. The idea that these are, what they're frightened of is the kind of Hans Andersen sadistic, punitive kind of violence. I don't think they're actually frightened in that sort of way by the kind of natural violence that you get represented in fairy stories. There's something in them that understands it. It's not alien to them, and it's a way of mediating that aspect of them, probably their own psyches and the psyches of those around them, that I think makes it less alarming rather than more alarming.
No, I think that has to be right. In fact,
that was Bettelheim's view. He was a Freudian,
right.
not a Jungian, but I mean, he also felt that they had a therapeutic element to them.
Of course, he went too far in that direction. I mean, to the point of treating them most instrumentally. That's the great Freudian illness, right? Of course, is where Jung is immeasurably superior to Freud. Is that for Freud, there's the therapeutic explanation also becomes the deflationary explanation, the reductive explanation. Whereas I go back and forth on Jung myself. You know him much better than I do, but I go back and forth because, but the thing I do appreciate is that this doesn't become an exercise in reduction to psychological functionalism, so that what our dreams do is express certain desires that can't be articulated otherwise, but then under the constraints of a certain prior set of inhibition, so on and so forth. But once you've said that, you've explained what dreams are. Whereas Jung, I don't think, was ever foolish enough to think that that's what dreams are, even if you could say that in the course of your dream life, other sides of yourself are being clarified or expressed or explored, and not only of yourself, but of a wider self, a wider realm of consciousness in which you participate.
He also saw it as potentially emergent aspects of your psyche that had not found a way of taking root in your conscious life. So it was essentially a creative relationship with dreams he had. I mean, Freud saw them very much as a sort of wastepaper basket in which we put the unacceptable aspects of ourselves that, we couldn't deal with and society couldn't deal with. Whereas Jung saw them as, occasion that too, but also, and the dark aspects of ourselves that we could then therefore more actively relate to, not dispense with. But he also saw it as having emergent properties and creative potential properties, as well as having this larger, more collective idea of being linked to the world, society at large, and also different periods of history. I mean, in that sense, he was very bold in his thinking about dreams, I think.
Well, it appeals. Well, of course, I have to admit, I'm terrifically superstitious about dreams. I tend to think that there have been dreams in my life in which I discovered things, truths that otherwise would have remained veiled from me. But also, I'm not at all averse to the ancient intuition that in your dreams you're also, if you think many of the ancient books of dream interpretation, East and West, either the spirit leaving itself and entering into a larger realm,
sure,
or becoming, in a sense, almost sort of psychically porous to other minds or other realities. Prophetic dreams that free oneself from the close confines of your everyday, ordinary consciousness, only to find yourself in strange connection with other. And I'm being vague as I say this, because of course one tries to avoid divulging too much of one's oddness in public. But there are those. I've had dreams, and this was more the case when I was younger. It hasn't been the case in recent years, in which I dreamed an event that then happened. Right, and
I've experienced that a lot when I was working as an analyst. I had several. I must tell you, David, that actually the people who most often had that kind of dream were the least interesting and exciting on the. Actually, there were 2 or 3 people I saw who had more than one dream that it was clearly. One very ordinary and very nice, but very unremarkable man had a dream which absolutely presaged the falling of the Berlin Wall. I remember thinking, my God, when that happened, that's what I was dreaming about. So, yeah, I have personally experienced cases where it's, I can testify that the dreams seem to me very clearly to be predicting something that was going to happen.
Well,
and I'm sure you have had them too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. Well, actually, more concrete. Quite often, I'll be honest, some of them were so entirely mundane that I thought fate was playing a trick on me. Why did I dream this ahead of time? Like meeting someone briefly on a pavement to discuss where I could buy some pens or something. But someone to whom this happened with fair regularity was my father, who was a man who was incapable of making things up. I mean, I don't mean he was unimaginative. I just mean
No, I know what
he
you
was
mean.
incapable of dishonesty. Sorry, that
Like my
sounded.
father, yes, I
Yeah,
understand. Yeah.
yeah. And he would describe this happened more than once. He would describe something that just from nowhere, like being lost with my mother on a snowy night, driving up to a house, meeting a man there who lived who was wearing a cardigan, and let him. And then that would happen. I mean, scene for scene. The very house that he dreamt ahead of time. Or once when he mentioned a dream he'd had of walking in the streets of London with me. Well, there was no reason why that made any sense, because we had no plans to go to London at any time. We were living in Maryland in the U.S. But he described a certain gate, and then a year and a half later, for reasons that had been unexpected, we were in London together, and we came upon that gate with the very design that he had described in it, a place he'd never been. So, I mean, there is a sense in which the dreaming mind slips free from the fetters of time.
Absolutely.
And so it seems to me, perfectly reasonable to think that, as was the standard view in the classical Chinese romantic or texts or dream interpretation texts or whatever, that it slips free also of location and space and consorts with other dreaming minds in a sort of different.
Well, of course, time is one of the elements that we still don't know that much about, do we? I mean, there remain enormous mysteries about how time works. So it doesn't surprise me at all that there is that kind of loping ahead or loping back that can take place when our unconscious minds are free to roam.
I think we talked last time we spoke about these other odd experiences that suggest that we're the physically reductivist model, of course, of consciousness as being a sort of cognitive functional system that's locked within one's neurology and one's skull, and therefore doesn't participate at large, does seem to defy experience. And one of the experiences, of course, that we've talked since we've mentioned Jung, it's worth mentioning, of course, it's just the experience of synchronicity, the experience of that just happens with such extraordinary regularity that it seems to defy common sense to suggest that there isn't really a realm of conscious communion that lies outside again our ordinary exchanges. That there's, but as I say, I think we talked about that last time. Although again, it's happened between you and me.
Very often.
Yes, because I mean, again, nothing terrifically exciting. It's just that the same book or the same author comes up at the same time. We when we're talking, exchanging on email, we ask each other about the same book, yes, the same writer, and it just happened, 5 or 6 times this past year, and. I just at a statistical level, I can't write that off as coincidence, well, especially when it was simultaneous. So then the greatest, or not the greatest, but the foundational fairy tale of Western culture, who's sadly often not recognized as being a fairy tale, but all the more significant and important when it's recognized as such, is the story of the Garden of Eden. At least that one.
A great story.
It's a great story, yes. It's all in the so-called Yahwist part of the canon, and the Yahwist literature is the most fairy tale-like. I mean, it's the most, again, antinomian in one sense, right? I mean, in the sense that it's not, as the priestly and the Elohist material is, as concerned with law or even good conduct. Even God is given a kind of capricious quality in that aspect of the canon.
It was you who pointed out to me that if you read the story as it's given, as we receive it anyway, God in fact lies to Adam and Eve, and the serpent tells the truth.
Yeah.
And I hadn't observed that. I had been thinking about it anyway, but you're absolutely right. Because he says, from the moment you eat this fruit, you will die. And I mean, in fact, as a result of having eaten the fruit, they are, as it were, condemned to death. So I suppose you could take it in that.
Oh, the theological interpretations are fine. I mean, this is the thing. I don't believe in trying to isolate authorial intention. I think the ancient world's approach to texts was much wiser. And again, I think the healthiest tendencies and Jungians, I give them full credit for this, are to recognize that there are levels of meaning in these things that can be explored almost endlessly. But yeah, I mean, it's as scandalous as it sounds to the ears of some very devout people. If the text is fairly explicit on this, that because Yahweh then goes to the other Elohim and says, "Oh dear, they've eaten, they now are like us." That was, the snake was telling the truth. They would become like gods or God. It's hard because the word there is Elohim in the Hebrew, but the Septuagint definitely understands that as you will be like gods, or the gods, The
Elohim being a host rather than a
right. But also, of course, Elohim is also used in the text as the collective name. I mean, we have both there in the text because we have such a melange of different textual traditions and usages. But yeah, he goes to them and tells them, they are like gods. We have to get them out of here before they eat from the tree of life and become immortal. So they're sentenced to death not because they're intrinsically or even were supposed to become immortal, but quite the opposite. That because their natural mortality is preserved by their expulsion from the garden. But this is the thing. When I speak of this fairy tale, the conversation we've had is just that what's fascinating about it, what makes it so rich when read without literalist or doctrinal presuppositions, or reading it as the redactors give it to us as neatly, well, not neatly, actually, it's not seamlessly, but merged with material from other times and other traditions. You do have something of a wonderfully ambiguous,
very much.
On one hand, antinomian, on the other hand, moral in another way. I mean, there are moral dimensions to the tale, but they don't have to do with what you call, as you say, the punitive prohibition. In a sense, the the question you have to ask yourself is what is the better estate before the serpent enlightens them.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point out, by the way, for those who are scandalized by this sort of language, that even many of the church fathers realized that at the literal level, this is what the text was saying. This is why it was, you had to allegorize in order to extract a higher spiritual reading out of the text. As if you stayed at the literal level, what you had was a story about a mischievous God thwarted by a mischievous snake, and humanity caught in between them. But what is their better estate? To remain in ignorance and innocence, but cared for well enough. I mean, with living in a garden, or to acquire knowledge, to acquire and leave the garden. Is it or is it not a tragic division of perspective to break reality down into good and evil, when before that, in sort of infantine innocence, neither category existed for them or needed to exist, because they were already in a state of innocence beyond, or prior to, but in a sense beyond such divisions.
As you know, I have one of my thoughts about that story is that the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or good and bad, or the range of things, expresses itself in human life by human beings' tendency to think they know what the difference is between good and bad. In the title of one of my favorite books, My Trollop, he knew he was right. Now, I don't mean that there isn't such a thing as good and bad. I think there is such a thing as good and bad, but I think one of our...
Well, especially in opera productions, apparently.
Most certainly in opera productions, and in all kinds of other things.
Well, less important things.
Takes on the Bible, various other things. But I do think that one of the ways it's interesting to interpret that is they left with an idea that they did know the difference between good and bad. And if you look at the tremendous moralism of our current age, where there are pronouncements made all the time, this is right, if you deviate from this, you are wrong, you're bad. This resurgence of the age of the Puritan, it seems to me a very striking and rather sort of tragic example of one result of eating that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because I don't think we do actually know the difference. I mean, I think human beings are liable to make pronouncements about what is right with horrible consequences, and that happens in bringing up children, it happens in education, it happens in directing opera productions, it happens across the whole sphere of human activity, but in important, really serious, important things like who can have the vote, who's considered a legitimate member of society, what color skin is right, etc., etc. So that's one of my thoughts about that story. As I've confided that to you privately, but as we're doing this in public, I throw it out to whoever is.
I mean, of course, I mean, as we know, the phrase good and bad, I suppose, in a sense, just in one sense, does mean just knowing everything. I mean, that's in the original Hebrew, just being aware of all things and all their aspects. But it does have also the meaning of prior evaluation. So on the one hand, yeah, it's moral. It's also a material judgment. The gods of ancient Near Eastern mythology are aristocrats. They know the value of things, and and knowing the value of things, they're jealous of what they have. They don't want to sell. They don't want to share them, and that's part of the meaning of the story here. They know the value of precious stones. The gods live among precious stones. They know the value of clothing. Whereas the poor, little clay peasants that have been created to keep the garden don't even know they're naked, because they're so innocent, they don't know to covet. And this is, I've always thought, again, Paul, I think, is one of the most misunderstood figures in the Bible, because there's so heavy a panoply of doctrinal misreadings that have gathered around his figure, that getting to the man himself is often very difficult. But when his reflections on, before I knew the law, transgression. I mean, it's precisely the law that makes him aware of sin, and as such makes him a prisoner to sin. The
Yeah.
need, and I've always thought that this was also part of his reading of the Genesis story, because he uses the story of Eden, the way it's used in the book of Wisdom, as talking about how sin and death enter the world. I don't think he's literalist about it, although obviously it's impossible to tell. It's just that Paul doesn't seem to be a literalist about anything. He's very much a sort of Hellenistic, allegorical reader of Scripture. But whatever the case, whether he believes that this is something that happened in real time or in the dream time or whatever, that I've always thought that those antinomian elements in Paul, that are especially pronounced in a book like Galatians early on, but that are there in Romans too, in which he affirms the goodness of the law, but in this very qualified way, that it can condemn but not set us free. That's precisely the sort of apprehension he has, is that there's a kind of tragic alienation from an original nature, from a first nature, that brings with it all the things that he condemns as sin. I mean, the failure to love others, which is the principal transgression for him, but also covetousness, philorgia, the love of money, that all of these categories of distinction and evaluation of a simple and univocal good and evil are something he's struggling against, fighting against. This is the great liberating, because he's within a certain tradition that at the beginning of what became Rabbinic Judaism, but in a moment when it does, Rabbinic Judaism hasn't yet developed that incredibly rich sort of sense of Talmudic layers of commentary, and in which the text is rather than a sort of propositional set of rules, is a kind of language of love between the people of Israel and God. That hasn't fully developed yet, but Paul is already aware that the law, understood simply as law, is itself the spiritual predicament that has to be transcended.
Yes.
And so I think his reading of the Eden story may very well be like yours.
Well, strange bedfellows, Salley Vickers and St. Paul. But I'm delighted to think he might agree with me. I just want to, the other thing that interests me, which is slightly different, is, and you can correct me as much as you like, and you should, because it's not my area, but is this whole notion that appears to get suppressed with the redaction of the early books of the Bible. I mean, assuming the redaction happens after the return from Babylon in the 4th, 5th century, is this idea of Yahweh being married and his Asherah. And I, who was a tree goddess, for those who haven't come across her, and you don't come across her much.
Well, yes.
If you
this is like the family photos.
The Bible, as I have done, I mean, not exclusively, and I can't read Hebrew, unfortunately, but going through and looking up, you can see there is this sort of fluctuating. There are the occasional references to sacred groves that are planted by the sanctuary places where the burnt offerings are made. There are references to the high places. And sometimes these just sort of slip in and have obviously not got edited out. And sometimes they're actually part of a condemnation when Israel is going through one of its periods of basically Puritanism. So my thinking is these trees in the Garden of Eden, these two mysterious trees, I mean, they're mighty mysterious, actually. The knowledge of good and evil and the tree of immortality.
You should say that with an Oklahoma accent.
Sorry?
You should say that with an Oklahoma accent if you're going to say they're mighty, Mr. or Texan. Mighty. But anyway, go.
Mighty was a fairly fundamental English phrase before.
I know, but it's ours now. Not even ours. I mean, I'm from the East Coast, but it's like a lot of supernumerary usages that used to be British that are now considered quaint, like gotten, which could get smirks from my English friends, even though it's perfectly good English.
Oh, I know that I do know. Anyway, those mighty mysterious trees.
Yes, ma'am.
As a child, when I first came across this story, I thought, why did they choose that tree? Why not the tree of immortal life? Now, there's a puzzle. But it seems to me the significance of these trees, that whatever that story emerged from, and of course it emerged in a period when, again, I'm not trying to teach you to suck eggs, the very early Israelites, there were clearly a multiplicity of divinities. There wasn't necessarily Yahweh. Yahweh kind of grew, didn't he, in significance as their history evolved, because early on it looks as though Baal and Ishtar and any number of
to a fairly late date in the text we have,
yeah. So my wondering is, and also I noticed that there are references to Yahweh, but in various, and I can't now remember where they come, but they're in various of the Old Testament books where he's given the characteristics of the feminine. I mean, he talks about breasts, being fed by breasts and embraced. So he's acquired these rather feminine characteristics, which I feel must be a hangover from the period when, like it or not, he appears, and you'll know better than me how solid this is, but there appears to be a lot of evidence that Yahweh had a wife. And not only that, but he wasn't by any means the top god. He became the top god because of his particular relationship with Israel. And I have this feeling that when they came back from exile, because of the terrible shock to the psyche that from two conquests by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, they needed to kind of group around a far more legalistic and authoritarian Yahweh, whereas the former versions strike me as very much more I don't know what the right word is, but open, generous, extensive in attributes, and with both male and female aspects.
Well, I think what is the case is that under Persians whose reignty, there was a desire to create a fully coherent canon of scripture that accorded with the religious leanings of the empire, Persian Empire.
Yeah.
And as well, which so body of law, a truly now emergent monotheism out of a henotheism that was part of just a polytheism stretching back into prehistory, and that Yahweh is a sort of the most fascinating. I mean, it does seem to be the case that the gods of storm and thunder who defeat the primordial serpent or whatever, quite often are the ones that get elevated all the way up, the hierarchy of divine offices. But also, I mean, I think the evidence is exceedingly good. Yes, that before the development of after Josiah, after the Babylonian period, after what became really this austere and beautiful and philosophically enriched monotheism was also, the Yahweh was did have a wife, and there was nothing particularly scandalous about this, but this became part of the struggle for identity that also is the long and slow and very consequential division of identity between Israel and the Canaanites. It is written as a story of supplantation and invasion, but that's a very questionable version. Even the story of migration is one that has to be handled very carefully because the evidence is mixed. But one of the, I think one of the aspects also of the history of Jewish monotheism that's never treated of properly is the influence of Hellenism. Because the way we were taught, of course, that there was just this, Jewish monotheism had been Hebrew monotheism, and this was attested in Scripture and always been the case, and that there was a great Auseinandersetzung with Hellenistic culture with its pagan polytheism. Of course, the reality of the matter is it's probably much more the case that the developed Greco-Roman metaphysics and religion of the time, with the most philosophically inclined classes, were pure monotheists. I mean, they're gods, they're daemons, they're intermediate divinities, but this sense of the transcendent God and a metaphysics that attaches to it and can be exploited, whether it's in the language of Platonism or in the modified language of Stoicism, which you find in Paul, in the Gospel of John, that in a sense, Jewish monotheism in part was influenced and advanced by Greek culture, just as much as Greek culture. And this is one of the reasons why there was such an admiration for developed Judaism, for the purity of its worship, throughout the Greco-Roman world. And this, too, is part of the story that we rarely reflect on.
It's the case, isn't it, that for quite a long period, they discard, Baal, and particularly Baal was, and the high places had to be destroyed in quite savage ways. Yahweh was their God, but they did know there were other gods that other people had. And their God was a better God. So
better, stronger.
A truly transcendent God is quite long, isn't it? And actually, I was thinking the other day, it's not at all an odd concept to people who've been brought up within a Christian tradition, whether or not they're Christians. But it must have been a very odd idea when it first appeared. Monotheism is not, to us it doesn't seem odd whether we believe in it or not, but in a world which was very polytheistic, it's an extraordinary idea, actually. It's a real advance as an idea, isn't it?
Yeah, and one that can't appear at the beginning. There's simply no. The version of the story that we had in Sunday school could not possibly be the case, but it's just an odd idea. It is curious. That quite often it's Yahweh's superiority over the other gods that marks a special vocation for Israel, and therefore you need the other gods precisely for that reason. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, Yahweh may be a strange God in that he prefers no image be made of him. This is the first, obviously, this is one of the steps towards a kind of higher notion of divine transcendence. But even so, if he's in a pagan temple, next to the image of another God because the Ark of the Covenant has been captured, and he is literally seated on the mercy seat there, the invisible presence. He will get down at night and knock over the image of the other God in order to make a point. Mightier than Dagon.
Yes.
I can knock his statue over, but he can't touch me because I'm not a there's no image of me at all even to touch. I'm beyond his grasp. I'm sorry, I'm speaking now in the voice of God. I do that with fair regularity. I shouldn't.
Sounded very well for him, David.
Yes, thank you. But I mean, yeah, it's that in a sense, it's first God by order of magnitude greater than the other gods that makes room for the singular subversive thought that ultimately the divine principle behind things is not a God, but God in this transcendent sense. And Israel didn't get there any more quickly than anyone else did, really. It's actually only as we're through the Persian period into the Hellenistic period that what we think of as monotheism really begins to take shape. And it is an odd idea because if we have a healthy temperament, I think any people with a healthy temperament, we should see sort of vital spiritual agency in nature.
Oh, yes.
I mean, and nature does not present it to itself to us as a harmony or as a unity as such. It may be, but we have to seek for that. That's a deeper level of apprehension. That's when we see the Tao or the God beyond the gods. Our first experience of nature is of contending elemental forces. And we associate those with spirits, and then, or by the time of, the Second Temple period, with the angels of the elements, the angels of the weather. You find these in the Book of Enoch. So it makes perfect sense to think of the divine principle in plural terms, and it takes a secondary sort of moment of speculative reflection to realize that plurality cannot exist without some sort of deeper ground or wider context of unity that explains it. And then slowly, generation upon generation, the idea of the highest God becomes detached from the other gods, and then God in the full sense. This is all rather obvious, I suppose, but I'm being laborious here. But so it shouldn't scandalize Christians, though it often does, to discover that the original religion of Israel, the religion of the Hebrew Bible, especially in its unredacted form, is not the Judaism of later centuries.
And in many ways, it's rather attractive, I think, that the qualities that Yahweh has, particularly if he has his wife Asherah, coupled with the other gods, I think gives a richer range of divine aspects than when Yahweh is sort of funneled into a rather restrictive model and turned into a god who has to compete with other gods and whose priests and followers have to behave with extraordinary savageness towards the worshippers of other gods, which seems to be an aspect of his temperament, which isn't necessarily there in the very origins.
Well, it's hard to say, actually. I mean, the thing I find oddest about ancient Near Eastern myth, and I think one of the curious things about the redaction of the Book of Genesis is that the pre-patriarchal literature is arguably older, at least as written text, than the patriarchal narratives. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob probably have a concrete historical, oral or written form well before the period when we're getting story, before the period that produced a written form of the story of either the creation or of any of the episodes that follow in that so-called mythic or pre-patriarchal period. Noah, the sons of El being smitten with love for the daughters of man, the discovery of brick and mortar leading to the building of the Tower of Babel, which isn't really about a tower, Tower of Babel, however you pronounce it, and that much of that may have been from late developments in Mesopotamia and ancient Near Eastern stories that are sort of exogenous to the people who wrote, to the tradition that produced the patriarchal narratives. But, and then these stories get assimilated to the people's deity, Yahweh or El. I mean, these are two distinct figures early on, but it's a different issue.
Seem to be, yeah. It seemed to be what I could tell.
And so it may very well be the case that material, is a fairly late addition to the literature and self-understanding of Israel. It's hard to say, but now
I was still interested in those trees, though.
Oh yeah, the trees. Yeah, why did you bring up the trees again? There was
well, because I think it's possible it's a hangover from the idea that he had a wife, and Asherah was his wife. There's something about those trees that seems to have a significance that, it's I can't really say more than a kind of sense of something that's something left out. That the story has been, elements of the story have been refined in order to be put into a certain kind of narrative, but there's an element left out because those trees seem to be so significant.
It could definitely be a residual image of a sacred grove, and
a sacred goddess,
which tends to be the way mythologically this works. The keeper of the trees,
yeah, exactly.
And generally trees that confer immortality, that is, the trees that grant the gods their immortality. I mean, we all know this from Wagner, right? From Das Rheingold.
Not all of us.
Yes, well.
I do, yes.
Oh, it's all about how capitalism, capitalist motives ended up with the cheating of the laborers of their, the access to apparently the fruit of immortality. It gets a bit confusing, as allegories do. But no, I mean, I understand that the association of the fruit of immortality, the fruit of unending life, or the milk, and it's not a guardian, it's a tutelary goddess, makes perfect sense. And the way in which sacred groves were consecrated quite often. And it's interesting. I mean, of course, in the text we have, there's some evidence that there were two different textual traditions, one that only mentioned one tree and the one that mentioned two. But whatever the case, I'm willing to. I'm not sure if that would have occurred to me, that image tells us. But I think on the whole, yes, that there is a Mrs. Yahweh. I don't know how to put this. There is this figure that is removed from the textual tradition at the period of redaction, I've always thought, interestingly, though, that the scribes, the Second Temple period, those who produced the final version of Torah and Tanakh, were not. I don't think they were careless. I don't think they were always concerned to efface all of the mythic material because there's so much that's left in. But
it's sort of left in strange gobbets, isn't it? You know, sometimes you just get a reference to a tree, and then sometimes it's more, well, we've got to get rid of those trees, you know, dangerous trees.
Trees are, trees are subversive.
Very subversive. Very subversive.
Well, whatever the case, just to wrap it up, I guess, I do think that thinking of the Eden narrative, the Yahwist narrative, as fairy tale, and as, in a sense, a primal fairy tale, because I think every fairy tale is a really, to my mind, not every, but I mean, I think that paradigmatically, they're always at the threshold between innocence and knowledge, between they always deal with the dangerous borderland between sort of innocent, naive, pre-moral, post-moral, amoral, anti-moral, but nonetheless guileless state that we can associate with childhood, but not only with that, with our cultural childhood too, perhaps, and the world outside, the disenchanted world, and that the longing for the lost estate, but not in a way that deprives us of everything that's been gained by the passage through history, or whatever you want to call it, is something that's what it's precisely. I think that kind of ambiguous longing that makes great fairy tales, or makes the spirit or the atmosphere of fairy tales so profoundly evocative, is that it's kind of a suppressed memory in all of us, a memory either of our own childhoods or of something deeper than that, something even more original, and a longing and a hope for a recovery of that absence of division, that point where the total reconciliation, where we no longer need the categories of good and bad, good and evil, of evaluation. The return to that first estate, and there was some other point I was going to make. It was actually brilliant. It was the denouement of this line of reflection, and I've just completely lost it.
Well, while you're thinking of it, I will just chip in and say it's what Ian McGilchrist would ascribe this to, the right hemispheric aspect of our ability to apprehend the world, which is capable of comprehending diversity as unity, and that the estranged world in which we have to spend too much of our time is a result of the predominance of the left hemispheric attitude, which
security. Sorry, I interrupted.
I didn't hear the interruption. Tell me the interruption.
Oh no, I didn't mean to. I thought I was cutting you off there. No, I mean, that's an interesting, interesting question of agency there, because.
But I mean, what he would say is that he's not saying it's just a product of the right brain at all. He's simply saying that the right hemisphere apprehends that world that is perhaps most often met by us with things like fairy stories, or indeed dreams, I would say, and that these are primal parts of our nature that that when we lose touch with, we are impoverished, and we have nostalgic longing to return to recover.
Well, because it's a deepening division within ourselves, isn't it? I mean, it's I quite like Ian's books, and in fact, I'm doing one of these recorded conversations with him in the not too distant future, I believe. And and of course, he's always anxious to point out he's not talking, he's not suggesting that that one hemisphere, the good hemisphere, is, and then there's the bad hemisphere. But it is true that we seem, I mean, just as in personal intentionality, and I think this is probably true of us as a species, we can, in some sense, determine how we perceive reality. It's like, when you're confronted with an optical illusion that is it can be seen as either two vases or two profiles or a vase, right?
Oh, yes.
You can make yourself switch back and forth between seeing one as the other. The consciousness isn't passive. Intentionality constructs the finite aspects of things out of what would otherwise just be an infinite storm of sense impression. But that means, it would seem to me, that it's also possible that not only as individual psychologies, but as a race, epochally, we can be making intentional decisions on how we perceive. So it is quite possible that as intentional agents, we choose, we're in the habit of, we make ourselves think more through the perspective of, say, the right hemisphere, which is capable, which for him, for Ian, it gives us a fuller and more perspicuous sense of reality as such, as an integrity and a unity in which there are both clarities and ambiguities, and makes room for both. Yep. Or make ourselves see intentionally, over the course of history, become habituated to thinking through the perspectives of more available by the left hemisphere, which is rather narrow by itself, and that isolated from the other hemisphere is the more fragile and more easily deluded and helpless sort of aspect of our neurology. Because I believe that consciousness isn't reducible to our neurology, I see this intentional capacity as kind of our spiritual ability to determine, just as we do all the time. I mean, intentionality is always at work fashioning the world we know. I mean, this is the great discovery of the phenomenological tradition in European philosophy, and that we have reached a point where, and Ian's right about this, where we've embraced a model of rationality that's not so much rational as it is analytic in the most destructive sense. That it can take apart but can't put together.
The notion of consciousness that you're talking about and disagreeing with is a computable, or do I mean computatable? I don't know what the word is.
Anyway, computational?
Something that computational. Thank you. That's the word I want. Something
it's all yours. It's all yours.
Something that can be computed, whereas, I mean, that actually doesn't make sense for all the sorts of reasons that you know about. So that would appear to be a theory of consciousness that has arisen out of the left hemispherical way of thinking about things, which is in itself
problematic. Well, I mean, in philosophy of mind, especially in the Anglophone world, you can ask yourself, say, how the Churchlands or Daniel Dennett can say the sort of things they say. Do they really believe this? I mean, does Daniel Dennett really believe that you can reduce subjective consciousness to just a token of a certain function within a larger unconscious functional system, and therefore, in a sense, the notion that what we think of as consciousness is the intrinsic awareness of a subjectivity is an illusion, as is, of course, intentionality, as being something that actually, or unity of apprehension. Now, naturally, we say to ourselves, well, but these things recommend themselves to us in a rather immediate fashion. That is, reality as such tells us the consciousness and unity of apprehension, intentionality are primary data. So how is it that not only that Dennett can propose this, but that so many people can take him seriously? You have to take, I think you have to make room for the supposition that this is a person who has supremely willed or supremely been shaped or shaped himself to attend only to the deliverances available immediately in that, say, left hemispheric way.
Well, that's exactly what Ian would say.
While suppressing the knowledge of the real, the fuller vision, that a fully integrated consciousness is capable of, and in fact, requires. And because otherwise I can't account for it. I can't account for it psychologically. To read a book like Consciousness Explained by a man who's very intelligent. I've never denied the intelligence of Daniel Dennett, and yet everything he's saying is so sublimely ridiculous because somehow it has floated free of that grounding in the integrity of experience, the unity of experience and world, the ability to see rationally, imaginatively, intuitively, all at once, and to recognize the self-evident. It actually can abstract itself from its own experience to the degree that it can deny that experience.
Well, actually, Occam's razor would require us to accept. I mean, it seems to me Occam's razor would require us to accept that if these things are being experienced, then therefore it's likely there is something that is being experienced that's true. I mean, if there's sufficient examples of it, you can't explain it away by saying, well, that's just, it's better to start by accepting that this is how one way in which experience is experienced, and assume that there's a reason for that, rather than just slice it away and make it an irrelevance. Have you come across the Roger Penrose's theories of consciousness?
Oh, I've read them. Like the quantum tunneling ones and things like that. Yeah.
Well, the idea of the quantum mechanical element. I mean, it removes the determinist argument. I think I'm a bit biased. I mean, I lived with him for some time. He and I were in a relationship together, and he's a very, very brilliant person.
He's definitely that, yes.
He's also a very nice person, very dear person. But I think that's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't go along. I don't know about these microtubular things that his colleague talks about. It sounds a little odd, but I think it's interesting that he's given a whole look to the notion of free will and determinism.
Well, what I think is important about it, I mean, I always I caution my physicist friends sometimes to say, well, remember that you can. There's more than one kind of physicalist reductionism. If you're not talking about consciousness in the ways that it defies reduction, but you're trying to explain, say, determinacy or indeterminacy. In either case, you're not really talking about, say, freedom of the will, because an indeterminate event is no freer than a determinate event. It's whether or not there's actual consciousness and intentionality at work. But I think what's wonderful about Penrose's thesis, and boy, is that it goes some way towards saying that if you're going to reduce, say you're someone like the Churchlands who think that consciousness can be reduced to neurology, so that ultimately you could describe psychological states in a way that aren't psychological, that have none of the folk psychology of such preposterous entities as beliefs, desires, will,
nonsense like that.
Yeah, nonsense like that, which we simply can't exist because it's not fixed by the facts of physics. So it doesn't exist. There's a slight circularity in their reasoning, yes. But they assume a reductionist narrative that, first of all, that higher system level functions can always be reduced without remainder to lower level. That's already problematic. There are many good philosophical arguments against that. But, with Penrose's work, what's obvious is that the sequence of reductions you'd have to undertake is never going to get you down to a mechanical explanation of the sort.
No, absolutely. That's what's so.
It's going to keep ironizing itself.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the result will ultimately be that you just end up with the same mystery restated. When we get to this level, thankfully, we no longer have to presume that there's a causal closure of the physical that results in a mechanistic reduction of consciousness to, this neural impulse is somehow identical to this thought, or this thought is our illusory allegory of this neural impulse, whatever the hell that means. So, that aspect of his work I quite like. I'm not sure I understand the microtubules.
The microtubules sound to me like a rather, well, I can't comment on that. That sounds an odder aspect. But I like very much the idea that the rephrasing and the departure from the electrical neural systems in the brain, which has always struck me as a very depressing idea of consciousness. And as you say, ultimately, it isn't rational because it doesn't. It's not even answer anything fundamental.
Yeah, well, it's not even an explanation. That's the curious thing in philosophy. I think one of my great complaints against Anglophone philosophy of mind, there's the obvious one, which is, I think, that, as Ian would say, they've detached themselves from the experience of reality in a fairly radical way, and as a result, there's the absence of an appreciation of just how extraordinary these mysteries are, and that and of the impossibility of that kind of reductionism. But what I think I find more depressing still is that you'll find every attempt to produce a model of consciousness in physicalist terms never actually takes the form of an explanation.
No.
It always takes the form of a restatement of the problem in a way that momentarily looks like it's an explanation until you think about it. The brilliant philosopher in this country, Jaegwon Kim, who's written the best work on supervenience, the notion that consciousness is real, but it's a supervenient phenomenon. And as a result, whereas it's not just convertible in an identitarian sense with the physical processes underlying it, no change can occur at the level of consciousness that's not concomitant to a change at the physical level. Moreover, it's assumed that one event causes the other only within its own species, so that one conscious event, or not cause, but one conscious event can lead to another. And then it's dependent on the physical substrate, where there has to be a physical event, which isn't a mental state, isn't a conscious state, which causes another. Well, there can't be any cross causality here, because a mental state can't cause a physical, because that would violate the physical the causal closure of the physical, which is a doctrine, which is based. So what you end up with is that you've simply restated the problem that there's thought, there's the brain, and the two seem to be doing two radically different things, and yet in doing it in a correspondent harmony that isn't easily separable. And this is one of my great frustrations in debates over models of mind, is that they are just ways of modeling the problem in a slightly different grammar. And by doing that, they're allowed to overlook certain obvious things, like intentionality doesn't fit a mechanical narrative. If there is real intentionality, then it can't be physically reduced because it's teleological and mechanism is by definition not. Or, there is consciousness, there is subjectivity that's purely reflective, that's aware of itself being aware, or any of these other problems. Somehow, the way of dealing with them is simply to re-describe them in a way that for a time seems less scandalous to the materialist dogmatist.
I think the problem is that they, without an actual physical brain operating, there's nothing they can say about experience.
This is true.
And that makes for an overemphasis on the importance of the brain in this whole procedure. Because
I'm quite fond of my brain. I wouldn't want to have to function without it. But
I mean, we can't get the benefit of your experiences, unfortunately, if your brain happens to be dead. But I think that, to be rather simplistic, I think that's the root of the problem. Because without somebody who has got a brain alive, there isn't any report or any possibility of doing any kind of experiment. So it gives an overweight to the place of the brain in the whole procedure.
It also
because we haven't any access to experiences that are going on without a brain, although they may well be going on. And
well, I do, but only in certain special chemical states, perhaps. I don't know,
but your brain would still be there, even however sour it is in whatever particular exotic for her. It's that I think that for me, being a more simplistic person, it boils down to that. They've made a fundamental error. They think the brain is more important. They think it's primal. Because without a brain, they can't do any kind of work on what experience is. So they've misjudged it. Of course, it's relevant.
But even
not the most relevant.
even to conduct experiments on mind by conducting experiments on the brain. Well, I mean, there's the obvious thing. You can isolate correlations. But those correlations clearly aren't identities because this neuron firing is not me thinking about a conversation with Salley Vickers. Okay, it's just the thought and the and that same neuron will be firing in some other context. There's no one-to-one correspondence or even a sort of holographic correspondence.
That's another thing, yes.
But the other thing is the way you experiment on the brain, of course, is again and again, it's assuming that it can be isolated as a system of physical responses outside the context, even of the terms of the experiment. I mean, the famous example of this would be Benjamin Libet, and others who tried to show that there's no free will because they set someone else. Whenever you feel the impulse to do it, snap your fingers or twitch your wrist or whatever, and then electrodes on the skull.
Yes, quite.
Right. But what they leave out of their account of the data, of course, yes, they see that there's some electrical activity in the brain well before you snap the finger. And somehow they draw the conclusion that electrical activity is the act and the decision to act, even though they themselves have already stated the context here as you choose when you feel the impulse to. So it's a purely intentional act with a hermeneutical set of constraints. That's, if nothing else, it's actually the proof of free will. That I can, when I feel the impulse to do it, twitch my wrist. I wouldn't be twitching my wrist otherwise, just based on this. It wouldn't happen. It's not the actual electrical event and the twitch of the wrist are not identical. They're not even correlated with one another, except by crossing the interval of my conscious decision to twitch my wrist in response to the impulse to do so, which is something I agreed on 4 days ago when I decided I would take $150 to sit through this experiment. And you talk about left hemispheric thinking. You really have to have limited yourself to an extraordinary narrow perspective not to notice that the physical, that even the experiments you can do on the brain occur within a reality that's bounded by all sorts of, that occurs within a physical space, yes, but also within a hermeneutical space, which is apart from the physical.
But I think it's because, unfortunately, we're all guided by our own particular psychological dispositions. And if you have a psychological disposition that, for reasons that I can only guess at, prefers to see the whole of the universe as a very complex material puzzle, then everything you do will, however scientific you believe you're being, will be tending towards discovering that that is the case.
Yeah.
So it's probably, I doubt if people will ever be who are pursuing that kind of inquiry will ever be persuaded of a different way of looking at it. I don't think they will be persuaded by reason, because I think already the access to that form of reasoning has closed down. And this is, again, I mean, I'm using Ian as a sort of shorthand, but the whole functioning of the left hemisphere, as far as he's been able to convey it, would tend towards that kind of exclusion of alternative ways of looking.
Yeah. No, it definitely, yeah, right.
It's psychological bias, which, I mean, and I suppose you would say that you and I have a psychological bias in the opposite direction, and yes, I know I do.
Yeah.
I mean, because in my bones, I feel it's more likely to be true, because my bones are not really scientific tools or instruments.
Well, your bones are enthralled to your right hemisphere. Obviously, it's.
My bones are definitely right hemisphere.
But it's funny, isn't it? I guess we should be winding up because we're nearing the 2-hour mark. But I'll say this: it's one thing to say, well, I'm pursuing the scientific path, which allows me to eliminate from consideration extraordinary data, like extraordinary claims. So, though I may believe in synchronicity or whatever, I have no problem with the committed scientists say, well, I'm leaving that out of my calculations for now because that sort of experience is hard to attest, hard to verify, but what's amazing about this approach, the truly materialist approach to mind, is it obliges one to deny ordinary experience as well at the most fundamental level. I mean, as Paul and Patricia Churchland can say that the idea that that beliefs, that's folk mythology, and when we get a better paradigm and a better language for describing what's going on, what the chemical and electrochemical processes are that we, in our, this savage patois we use, because, as yet we have such a primitive understanding of the mind, that there's a wonderful kind of patrician ivory towerism in that phrase, folk psychology, that someone should apprise them of, because it doesn't really, it doesn't age well. But anyway, putting that aside. But when you have to eliminate beliefs, and of course, the claim to make is, well, but it's a failed theory. Folk psychology doesn't have predictive value as a scientific. This is the way a physical model. Well, of course, this is quite the opposite of the case. No physical inventory of atomic or molecular or physiological or neurophysiological events is going to tell you what I'm thinking or whether I believe it or not. Whereas there's a great predictive value in me saying, to someone, I believe you're trying to kill me.
Yeah,
from that, you can predict a great deal of and understand, give a rational account, a great deal of my subsequent behavior or my behavior up to that point. I mean, this is actually an exceedingly successful predictive model. Folk psychology, so-called, survives because it's a phenomenologically precise description of what we're actually doing.
Yes.
And to the notion that has to be reduced to be scientific is such a bizarre prejudice. And the strangest example of this I've ever come across, I always think the Churchlands are strange, Dennett's absurd, but there's a fellow named Alex Rosenberg who wrote a book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, back, I think, about 12 years ago or so, in which he spent chapters, a lot, I mean, it seemed like 60 or 70 pages, pointing out that it is impossible for neurology really to be about anything, so that intentionality cannot be merely a physical state or a physical reality or a physical operation about other things, right? He makes arguments that I've made myself, from which you would think that he would deduce that since there is intrinsic intentionality, I mean, presumably that's why he's writing a book, he believes that there's language and communication and ideas, that he would eliminate the theory. He'd say the theory doesn't fit the phenomenon. The theory must be eliminated. That it does seem to be basic scientific method. Instead, he eliminates the phenomenon. He says, but it can't be. There can't be intrinsic intentionality because that would be a fact that would not be fixed in place by physics, and physics fixes all truth. See, fairy tales are much more rational than that.
Yes.
I feel I'm ending with a screed. Yeah. So, anything else to say about Eden, fairy tales, consciousness? Roger Penrose and Ian McGilchrist. You're off to Corfu, is that right? Sure.
I'm off to Athens first.
Athens first.
My dear friend there, and then I'm off to Corfu.
Well, I envy you.
Yes, well, it is enviable.
Of course, with Athens, you have to sort of brace yourself for the motor car exhaust. But
happily, my friend lives about 5 minutes walk from the Agora and that whole area, and I can see the Acropolis. If I sit in one of the local bars and have a drink, I can see the Acropolis and the Parthenon just there before me. So that's a very reassuring sight.
Well, I envy you. I wish you bon voyage. Take some good reading material.
I will. I will. I tell you what I'm going to be taking. Your latest set of stories, which you kindly sent me.
Oh, that's right. Yes, they're unpublished, those. Yeah. I don't know. Yes, if you don't like them, don't tell me. Just sort of smile gently and say, you're getting there.
I wouldn't dream of being so patronizing to you. I've already read one of them all, as you know, so I think I will like them.
Okay.
All right. So good night from my end, or good day from your end.
Yeah, it's good afternoon. Excellent time to take the dog for a walk, actually. So I'll say goodbye. Thanks again. It's always lovely.
Give you my best.
I will. I will.
I give Roland my best. As you know, he and I are quite often in touch.
Yeah. No, I know. When I saw your signature in his copy of
Bentley
where three
Roads.
roads meet, yeah, I realized that you'd been conducting a secret correspondence with him, and I don't want to intrude on it. You know,
No, no.
he's a deep study.
Yes.
He's a deep file. So yeah,
Very, very deep. Yeah.
yes. Well, again, lovely to talk to you. Always good to see you, and thanks again for this, and take care.
Great pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.